Derek Sullivan was 29 years old, tired, and slightly drunk when he stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. He worked as a night janitor at the Harborside office complex in Sydney's business district, mopping floors and emptying trash bins in buildings that transformed from bustling corporate hives during the day to silent, fluorescent-lit mazes at night. This particular Thursday evening, Derek had finished his shift and joined some friends at the Golden Anchor, where the beer was cheaper and the music was louder. Around midnight, after his fourth pint and 2 shots of whiskey that he definitely shouldn't have accepted, Derek reached for his wallet to buy another round and discovered he was out of cash. "I'll be right back," he told his friends, words slightly slurred. ATM run. The nearest cash machine was 2 blocks away, mounted on the exterior wall of a Commonwealth Bank branch that had closed hours ago. The street was quiet, lit by the orange glow of sodium streetlights and the occasional passing taxi. Derek inserted his card and navigated the familiar menu. He had a credit card with a limit of $5,000, mostly untouched except for emergencies, and a savings account that, if he was being honest with himself, contained maybe $40 after rent and bills. His plan was simple: transfer $200 from his credit card to his savings account, then withdraw it as cash. It was a transaction he'd done dozens of times before, though the cash advance fees always made him wince. He pressed the buttons, confirmed the amount, and waited. Transaction canceled. The screen blinked the message at him in harsh red letters. His card ejected from the slot with a mechanical whir. "What the hell?" Derek muttered, squinting at the screen. He tried again. Same result. Transaction canceled. Card ejected. Derek stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, trying to process what was happening through the pleasant fog of alcohol. Maybe the system was down? Maybe there was something wrong with his card? Then he had a thought. What if he just tried to withdraw directly from his savings account? He inserted his card again, selected withdrawal, chose savings account, and punched in $200. The machine hummed and clicked. Bills began sliding out of the dispenser. 20 crisp $10 notes. Derek stared at them, then at the screen showing his updated balance. Negative $160. He took the money slowly, his alcohol-clouded brain trying to make sense of what had just happened. He definitely didn't have $200 in his savings account. He knew that with absolute certainty. He checked his balance obsessively just that morning, worried about an upcoming credit card payment, but here he was, holding $200 in cash that shouldn't exist. "Huh," Derek said to the empty street. "That's weird." Then he shrugged, pocketed the money, and walked back to the bar. He bought a round for his friends and forgot about it. Almost. At 2:30 a.m., Derek left the Golden Anchor alone. His friends had called it a night, but he felt restless, wired despite the alcohol. The walk home would take 20 minutes, and his route happened to pass right by that same ATM. As he approached the bank, he slowed down. The machine glowed in the darkness like a beacon. "Just check," he told himself. "Just see if it was a one-time thing." He inserted his card, navigated to transfers, and moved $200 from his credit card to his savings account. Transaction canceled, his card ejected. But then he tried the withdrawal again, directly from savings. It worked. Another $200 slid into his hands. Derek stood there, bills clutched in his fist, his heart suddenly pounding. The alcohol was wearing off now, replaced by a clarity that felt almost electric. He tried again, $500 this time. Transaction canceled for the transfer, but the withdrawal worked. $600, same result. By 3:15 a.m., Derek had withdrawn $3,000 in cash and was standing on an empty Sydney street corner, hands shaking, mind racing. He'd just discovered a glitch, a real, actual exploit-the-system glitch, an infinite money glitch. Before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from. Derek didn't sleep that night. He sat at his small kitchen table in his cramped studio apartment, spreading out the cash in front of him and trying to understand what had just happened. The ATM had refused to process the transfer from his credit card to his savings account. That much was clear, but it had allowed him to withdraw money from his savings account, even though his savings account didn't have enough money in it. Why? Over the next several days, Derek became obsessed with understanding the mechanics. He couldn't find anything about it online. No one discussing this particular glitch, no warning articles, nothing, which meant either it was incredibly rare or he was the first person to discover it. He tested it again the following night. Same result. And the night after that. Slowly a pattern emerged. The glitch only worked between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., when the ATMs went into some kind of offline mode for daily processing. During this window, the machines couldn't communicate properly with the central banking system. They would reject his transfer request, presumably because that required real-time verification. But they would allow withdrawals based on some kind of cache data or backup system. The key was making small transfers from his credit card during the day when the system was working properly. These transfers would show up in his account balance. Then at night during the glitch window, he could withdraw far more than he'd actually transferred, and the system didn't catch the discrepancy. It was like the ATM couldn't remember how much money he actually had. It just saw that he'd made some deposits and assumed he had funds available. Derek tested this theory meticulously. He transferred $50 during the day. That night he withdrew $500. His balance went negative, but no overdraft fees appeared. No angry letters from the bank. Nothing. The system was broken, and nobody seemed to notice. By the end of the first 2 weeks, Derek had withdrawn $23,000. He kept the cash in a locked box under his bed, counting it obsessively. 20s, 50s, hundreds, all crisp and real and absolutely illegal. Every single day, he expected the police to knock on his door. Every time his phone rang, his heart jumped into his throat. He checked his bank account constantly, waiting for it to be frozen or flagged or investigated. Nothing happened. The bank sent him his usual monthly statement, showing all his withdrawals but somehow not flagging the massive negative balance that should have triggered immediate action. No overdraft notices, no fraud alerts, no phone calls. It was as if the bank's systems were blind to what was happening. Derek couldn't understand it. He'd worked enough menial jobs to know that systems were supposed to catch this kind of thing. There should be automated flags, fraud detection, something. But there was nothing. On the 16th day, Derek decided to test the bank directly. He walked into a Commonwealth Bank branch during business hours, heart pounding, and approached a teller. "Hi," he said, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to check on my account status. Make sure everything looks okay." The teller, a young woman named Sarah, according to her name tag, typed on her computer for a moment. "Everything looks fine, Mr. Sullivan. Is there a specific concern?" No concerns. Just, being careful." "Smart. Let me know if you need anything else." Derek walked out of the bank in a daze. They had no idea. The teller had looked right at his account and seen nothing wrong. That night, he withdrew another $5,000. Within 6 weeks, Derek had technically become a millionaire. He didn't have $1 million in cash. Much of what he withdrew, he'd spent or kept in various hiding places. But his cumulative withdrawals had crossed the $1 million threshold. According to the ATM receipts he kept obsessively, he'd withdrawn $37,450 from an account that should have never allowed him to go more than a few $100s into overdraft. The money had transformed his life in ways both obvious and subtle. He'd quit his janitorial job, telling his supervisor he'd gotten an unexpected inheritance. His co-workers were surprised but happy for him, and he tipped everyone $100 on his last day, which seemed like a generous but believable amount for someone who'd just come into family money. His apartment was still the same small studio. Moving would create a paper trail, and Derek was becoming increasingly paranoid about paper trails, but now it contained a new laptop, a large television, expensive clothes still in shopping bags, and approximately $200,000 in cash hidden in various creative locations. He'd started traveling. Paris for a week, staying in a 4-star hotel and eating at restaurants where the wine cost more than his old weekly salary. Tokyo for 5 days, buying electronics and designer clothes. Barcelona, Rome, Amsterdam, cities he'd only dreamed of visiting back when he was cleaning office bathrooms for minimum wage. The private jet was his most extravagant expense, $92,000 to charter a flight for himself and three close friends to Bali for a long weekend. They'd stayed at a luxury resort, spent days on private beaches, and nights at exclusive clubs where Derek paid for everything with the casual confidence of someone who had infinite money. Because in a sense, he did. His friends Jake, who he'd known since high school, Olivia, a former coworker, and Derek's younger brother David, knew something was going on. They'd asked, of course, how a janitor suddenly had money for private jets and five-star hotels. I got into cryptocurrency early, Derek told them. Bitcoin, made some smart trades and cashed out at the right time. It was a lie that fit the era perfectly. In 2011, Bitcoin was just becoming a thing, mysterious enough that most people didn't understand it, but credible enough that sudden wealth seemed plausible. His friends accepted the explanation with a mixture of envy and congratulations. To everyone else, the hotel staff, the flight attendants, the restaurant servers who received his extravagant tips, he claimed to work in real estate investment or international finance. He bought expensive business casual clothes and practiced walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged in luxury spaces. The tips were real, though, and generous beyond belief. A waiter who provided good service might receive a $300 tip on a $100 meal. He paid for hotel rooms for homeless people he encountered, giving them a safe place to sleep and a hot breakfast. He donated anonymously to local charities, dropping off envelopes of cash with no return address. Part of it was guilt. Part of it was the simple joy of being able to help people in ways he never could before. But part of it, if Derek was being honest with himself, was also a weird form of superstitious bargaining with the universe. If he did good things with the money, maybe karma wouldn't destroy him when this all inevitably fell apart. But beneath the champagne and first-class flights and designer suits, Derek Sullivan was falling apart. Every single day began the same way. His eyes would snap open at dawn, his first thought always the same. Is this the day they catch me? He would lie there, heart racing, listening for the sound of police sirens or heavy boots on stairs, or that inevitable knock on the door. He'd imagine SWAT teams with their black gear and rifles, shouting for him to come out with his hands up. He'd picture himself in handcuffs, being perp-walked past cameras, while news reporters detailed his crimes. The paranoia had started small, but had grown into something consuming. Every phone call made his stomach drop. He would stare at the screen, seeing the bank's name or an unknown number, certain this was it. This was the call where they'd tell him they knew everything, and he was in massive trouble. But it never was. The bank called occasionally to confirm legitimate purchases. Just checking that you really did charge $8,000 at a hotel in Paris? But nothing more. Unknown numbers turned out to be telemarketers or wrong numbers or friends calling from new phones. He couldn't sleep properly anymore. The nightmares had started in week 3 and had only gotten worse. He dreamed of being chased, of being caught, of prison cells and courtrooms and his parents' disappointed faces. He dreamed of the money turning to ash in his hands, of ATMs that would swallow his card and trap him until police arrived, of bank officials who morphed into judges with gavels that sounded like cell doors slamming. During the day, he was constantly looking over his shoulder. He'd be sitting in a cafe in Melbourne or walking down a street in Sydney, and he'd see someone who might be watching him. A man in a suit lingering too long, a woman who seemed to be taking his picture, and panic would flood his system. Were they following him? Had the bank hired private investigators? Were federal agents building a case? He started changing his patterns constantly. Different ATMs every night, never the same one twice in a week. Different routes home. He paid for things in cash whenever possible to avoid creating digital trails. He used public computers at libraries to check his accounts, paranoid that his laptop was being monitored. His friends had started to notice something was wrong. "You seem jumpy, man," Jake had said during their Bali trip, watching Derek flinch at a loud noise by the pool. "You okay?" "Fine," Derek had replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But he wasn't fine. He was the opposite of fine. He thought about running. He could take $1 million, literal cash, and disappear. There were countries with no extradition treaties, places where someone with money could vanish completely. He researched it obsessively, how to get fake identification, how to move money internationally without triggering alerts. which countries ask the fewest questions about wealthy foreigners. He could go to Southeast Asia, or South America, or somewhere in Eastern Europe. He could become someone else entirely. Michael Thompson, or James Wilson, or whatever name seemed least suspicious. But that came with its own nightmare. Life as a permanent fugitive. Never seeing his family again. His parents in their small house in the suburbs, his brother David, his childhood friends. Never being able to return to Australia, to the beaches and cities he'd grown up in. Constantly looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life, wondering if today would be the day someone recognized him or Interpol came knocking. Was that really better than what he had now? 4 months into his exploit of the ATM glitch, Derek Sullivan made a decision. He was in his apartment at 2:30 a.m., having just returned from another late-night withdrawal, this one for $7,000, bringing his total to approximately $1.6 million Australian dollars, when something inside him simply broke. He sat on his bed, surrounded by money he shouldn't have, and realized he couldn't do this anymore. The paranoia had become unbearable. He wasn't sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night. He'd lost weight from stress. His hands shook when he went to the ATM. He'd started drinking more than he should, trying to quiet the constant anxiety in his head. The money had brought him incredible experiences, trips he'd never forget, the joy of helping people, the confidence that came with financial freedom. But it had also brought something else, constant, crushing, inescapable fear. He was 29 years old and had never done anything truly criminal in his life. He'd gotten a speeding ticket once. He'd maybe pirated some music in college, but nothing like this. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a janitor who'd stumbled onto a glitch and had made the worst/best decision of his life. And now he was trapped between two terrible options. Keep going and live with the paranoia, or stop and face the consequences. At 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in July 2011, Derek Sullivan picked up his phone and called the Commonwealth Bank's 24-hour customer service line. Commonwealth Bank, this is Trevor speaking. How can I help you? Derek took a deep breath. Hi, Trevor. My name is Derek Sullivan, and I need to report something. I've been exploiting a glitch in your ATM system for the past 4 months. I've withdrawn over $1.6 million that I don't actually have in my account. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat that? Derek did. He explained everything. The discovery of the glitch, the timing window between 1 and 3 a.m., the way the transfer would cancel but the withdrawal would work, how he'd been doing it nightly for months. I'm confessing, Derek said. I know what I did was wrong. I'm ready to face the consequences. I can't keep doing this. I need it to be over. Another pause. Sir, I'm going to need to transfer you to our fraud department. Please hold. Elevator music played for 7 minutes. Derek sat there, phone pressed to his ear, feeling a strange mix of terror and relief. It was happening. It was finally happening. Mr. Sullivan, this is Amanda Rodriguez from our fraud investigation team. I understand you've just made some very serious claims about our ATM system. Derek repeated everything again. Amanda listened, asking occasional clarifying questions. She was professional, taking notes, not expressing shock or anger or any emotion at all. Mr. Sullivan, I want to be very clear with you. What you're describing is theft and fraud on a massive scale. This is a serious criminal matter. We will need to report this to the police, and you will almost certainly face charges. Do you understand? Yes, Derek said. I understand. I'm ready for that. All right. We'll be conducting an internal investigation and will be in contact with you soon. In the meantime, do not attempt to access any of your accounts or make any additional withdrawals. Do you understand? Yes. And Mr. Sullivan, you should probably get a lawyer. The call ended. Derek sat in the darkness of his apartment, waiting for the relief to wash over him. It didn't come. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Nothing happened. Derek waited for the police to contact him. He stayed in his apartment as much as possible, expecting them to show up any moment with handcuffs and arrest warrants. He checked his bank account obsessively and found that it had been frozen, which made sense. But no other action had been taken. No detective called him. No lawyer reached out. No official correspondence arrived beyond a brief letter from the bank acknowledging that his accounts were under review pending investigation. He couldn't understand it. He'd confessed to stealing over $1 million and everyone seemed to just not care. 6 months after his confession, Derek finally called the bank again. "Hi, yes, my name is Derek Sullivan. I called back in July about the ATM glitch. I was told the police would be contacting me, but..." He was transferred 3 times, each person seeming confused about his case, before finally reaching someone in the fraud department who pulled up his file. "Oh, yes, Mr. Sullivan. We've documented your confession. As I understand it, the matter has been referred to the appropriate authorities. But when will they contact me? It's been 6 months. I'm afraid I don't have that information, sir. You'll need to follow up with the police directly." But when Derek tried to follow up with the police, they had no record of any referral. No case had been opened. No investigation was underway. It was as if his confession had disappeared into some bureaucratic void. 1 year passed, then 2, then 3. By 2014, Derek Sullivan had been living in a strange limbo for 3 years. He'd spent or hidden the money, most of it was gone, burned through on travel and expenses and generous gifts and the simple cost of living without working. His frozen bank accounts meant he couldn't access traditional banking, so he'd been living off cash and occasional under-the-table work. But no one had arrested him. No charges had been filed. The authorities had simply done nothing. Most people would have been relieved. Derek was not most people. The anxiety that had driven Derek to confess in the first place hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had gotten worse. He'd traded the specific fear of being caught for a more diffuse, existential dread. He'd stolen over $1 million and gotten away with it. The universe had somehow failed to deliver justice, and that bothered him more than he could articulate. He started seeing a psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Kim, a woman in her 50s who specialized in anxiety disorders and moral injury. "I need help," Derek told her in their first session. "I did something terrible, and I can't move past it." Over the course of several months, Dr. Kim helped Derek understand that he was suffering from a complex mix of anxiety, guilt, and what she called existential contamination. The feeling that he had fundamentally corrupted himself by crossing a moral line he could never uncross. "The money itself isn't really the issue," Dr. Kim explained in one session. "It's what the money represents. You've proven to yourself that you're capable of serious wrongdoing. You've discovered a part of yourself you didn't know existed, and you don't like what you found." "So what do I do?" Derek asked. "Well, one option would be to make amends. You've already confessed to the bank, but perhaps you need a more public form of accountability, something that closes this chapter definitively." "You mean like turning myself in?" "That's one possibility. Or you could simply tell your story, not to hide, but to own what you did. Sometimes the path to healing requires radical honesty." Derek thought about that conversation for weeks. He'd already tried confessing privately. The bank hadn't cared. The police hadn't followed up. Maybe Dr. Kim was right. Maybe he needed to go public. In September 2014, Derek Sullivan did something that would either save him or destroy him. He went public with his story. It started with a call to a journalist he'd found online, Emma Patterson, who wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald and specialized in financial crime stories. He told her everything, providing bank statements, ATM receipts, and a detailed timeline of his 4-month spree. Emma was skeptical at first, but the documentation was too thorough to dismiss. This was real. Someone had actually found and exploited a massive security flaw in one of Australia's largest banks. Her article ran on page 3 of the newspaper. "Janitor steals $1.6 million through ATM glitch. Banks fail to prosecute." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Derek's phone was ringing constantly. Other journalists wanted interviews. Radio shows wanted him on air. A television producer reached out about a documentary. Derek said yes to almost all of it. He appeared on morning talk shows, explaining the technical details of the glitch. He did podcast interviews, discussing the psychological toll of his crime. He sat for a documentary interview, talking about the money and the paranoia and the guilt that had driven him to confess. Through it all, One thing remained constant. The police still didn't contact him. It was surreal. He was on television, in newspapers, openly admitting to a massive fraud, and the authorities were completely silent until someone decided they'd had enough. On October 12, 2014, Derek Sullivan was finally arrested. It happened at his apartment, not with the dramatic SWAT team raid he'd imagined for years, but with two plainclothes detectives who knocked politely and asked him to come with them to the station. "Derek Sullivan, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and unauthorized access to a computer system," one of them said, almost apologetically. "You have the right to remain silent." Derek had imagined this moment hundreds of times. He'd pictured himself panicking, running, breaking down, but when it actually happened, he felt only a strange, profound relief. "Okay," he said. "Can I grab my jacket?" At the station, the detectives explained what had happened. After Derek's media appearances, a producer from one of the television shows had directly contacted the police, essentially turning him in. An investigation had been opened, and once they looked into it, the detectives had discovered something surprising. The bank had never actually reported Derek to the police, despite telling him they would. The confession he'd made 3 years earlier had been documented internally, then seemingly forgotten or ignored. No formal complaint had been filed. No referral had been made. It was only now, after Derek had gone public and forced the issue, that authorities were taking action. "If you just kept your mouth shut and stayed off TV," one of the detectives said, shaking his head, "we probably never would have known about any of this." Derek sat in the interrogation room, and for the first time in 3 years, he laughed. He'd gotten away with it, completely gotten away with it, and then he'd worked so hard to get caught that he'd essentially had to turn himself in on national television before anyone bothered to arrest him. The trial, when it finally happened, was strange from beginning to end. Derek had hired a lawyer, a public defender named Rachel Torres, who specialized in financial crimes. She reviewed the evidence and had one consistent reaction: confusion. "I don't understand how you did this," she said, looking at the technical details. "I mean, I understand what you did, but I don't understand how it worked. How did the bank not notice? How did their systems allow this for 4 months?" The prosecution had the same problem. The prosecutor, a serious man named Jeffrey Hammond, brought in bank technical experts to explain the glitch. They couldn't. They brought in Commonwealth Bank's head of security, who admitted under oath that they still weren't entirely sure how Derek had exploited their system. "We've patched the vulnerability," the security director testified, "but I'll be honest, we discovered the patch more through trial and error than through understanding the root cause. Mr. Sullivan somehow found a flaw in our overnight processing that our entire security team had missed." The judge, a woman in her 60s named Justice Patricia Morrison, listened to all of this with growing incredulity. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said during one hearing. "The defendant walked up to an ATM, found a glitch, exploited it for 4 months, withdrew $1.6 million, then called the bank and confessed. The bank told him he'd face serious consequences, then did nothing. 3 years later, the defendant went on television to talk about his crime, at which point he was finally arrested. And now, in this courtroom, neither the prosecution nor the bank can fully explain how any of this was technically possible. Is that accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jeffrey Hammond admitted. "This is perhaps the strangest case I've encountered in 20 years on the bench," Justice Morrison said. The trial itself was brief. Derek pleaded guilty. There was no point in fighting it, and honestly, he wanted the closure. The question became one of sentencing. The prosecution argued for significant prison time, 10 years given the amount stolen, but they struggled to make the case compelling. Derek had confessed voluntarily. He'd gone public voluntarily. He'd essentially turned himself in. He'd spent or lost most of the money, meaning there was nothing to recover. And most importantly, the bank's own negligence had made the crime possible in the first place. Rachel Torres argued for leniency. "Your Honor, my client discovered a flaw that a major financial institution had missed. Yes, he exploited it illegally, but he also exposed a massive security vulnerability that could have been found and used by someone far more dangerous: organized crime, international hackers, terrorist organizations. In a strange way, Mr. Sullivan's crime made the banking system safer. It was a stretch, but Justice Morrison seemed sympathetic. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge said during sentencing, "what you did was wrong. Theft is theft, regardless of how you accomplished it. However, I'm also mindful of several mitigating factors. Your voluntary confession, your clear remorse, the bank's failure to prosecute you despite your admission, and the bizarre circumstances of this entire case. I'm sentencing you to 1 year in prison, followed by 3 years of probation and community service. I'm also ordering you to pay restitution to the bank in the amount of, well, whatever you're capable of paying, which I suspect is very little." 1 year. For stealing $1.6 million. In the courtroom, Derek Sullivan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Prison was exactly as uncomfortable and dehumanizing as Derek had feared, but it was also, strangely, a relief. He was sent to a minimum security facility in Western Sydney, the kind of place for white-collar criminals and nonviolent offenders. He shared a cell with a man named Trevor, who'd been convicted of tax fraud and spent his days working in the prison library and attending mandatory rehabilitation programs. The other inmates found his story fascinating. He was the ATM guy, a minor celebrity among a population that appreciated creative approaches to crime. "You just walked up to a machine and took money?" a man named Tony asked him during lunch one day. Tony was serving time for armed robbery. "That's it? No weapons? No threats? No crew?" "That's it," Derek confirmed. "Man, I'm in the wrong business," Tony said, shaking his head. But what surprised Derek most about prison was how much his anxiety decreased. For the first time in years, he knew exactly where he stood. He was paying his debt to society. He had a defined end date. When he got out, this would be behind him. The nightmares stopped. The constant vigilance faded. He slept properly for the first time since 2011. He wrote in a journal every day, partly as therapy, partly as a record of his thoughts. He wrote about the discovery of the glitch, the escalation, the paranoia, the guilt. He wrote about what he'd learned about himself, that he was capable of both remarkable creativity and serious moral failure, that money couldn't actually buy happiness if it came with constant fear. That confession really was good for the soul, even if it took years to get anyone to listen. Dr. Kim came to visit him once a month. "How are you doing?" she'd ask. "Better," Derek would say, and he meant it. "This is where I need to be." His family visited too. His parents were disappointed but supportive. His brother David brought him books and told him about his life outside. His friends Jake and Olivia came once, awkward and uncertain how to act around their incarcerated friend, but trying their best. Derek served his full year without incident. He was released in October 2015, 4 years after his original discovery of the glitch, to a world that had mostly moved on from his story. Life after prison was harder than Derek had anticipated. He was a convicted felon now, which meant employment options were limited. No bank would hire him, obviously. Most retail establishments were wary. He ended up working at a warehouse, loading trucks and moving boxes for minimum wage. He lived in a small apartment in a less expensive suburb, taking public transit to work, living a life that looked almost exactly like his pre-glitch existence. Except now he had a criminal record and a story that followed him everywhere. The 3 years of probation meant regular check-ins with a probation officer, random drug tests, and restrictions on his travel. He paid a small amount of restitution to the bank each month, $50, all he could afford, toward a debt that would take him literally centuries to repay at that rate. But he was also, for the first time in years, genuinely okay. The guilt that had consumed him had finally eased. He'd confessed, been punished, and served his time. The chapter was closed. He could move forward now without constantly looking over his shoulder. He dated occasionally, though explaining his criminal past to new partners was always awkward. He reconnected with old friends and made new ones who knew his story and didn't judge him for it. He eventually found work as a facilities manager at a small office building. Not quite back to janitorial work, but close enough that he appreciated the irony. In 2017, he was approached by a journalist working on a book about financial crimes. She wanted to include his story. Derek agreed, under the condition that he could review anything written about him for accuracy. The book came out in 2018, Digital Heists, Modern Banking Crimes and the People Who Commit Them. Derek's chapter was titled The Accidental Thief. It was fair and thorough, portraying him as neither hero nor villain, but as a complex person who'd made a terrible decision and paid for it. Occasionally, someone would recognize him. "Wait, aren't you that guy from the ATM thing?" And he'd nod and confirm it, waiting to see if they'd judge him or congratulate him or just be curious. The reactions varied. He never returned to the specific ATM where it had all started, but he passed by that bank branch sometimes on his way to work. He'd look at the machine mounted on the external wall and remember the drunk, tired janitor who'd stumbled onto an infinite money glitch and made a choice that changed everything. Was it worth it? People asked him that all the time. The honest answer was complicated. The money had been incredible while it lasted. The trips, the experiences, the joy of helping people. But the paranoia, the guilt, the anxiety, the prison time, the criminal record, the difficulty rebuilding his life afterward. "I don't know," Derek would usually say. "Ask me in another 10 years. One detail that fascinated people about Derek's story was the bank's response, or lack thereof. The Commonwealth Bank had never publicly acknowledged the glitch. They'd patched it quietly after Derek's confession, but they'd never issued a statement, never warned customers, never explained how it had happened or how they'd fixed it. When journalists asked about it after Derek's trial, the bank's response was always the same. "We take security very seriously and continuously update our systems to protect our customers. We cannot comment on specific security measures." In 2016, a technology reporter named James Fitzgerald did an in-depth investigation into banking security and discovered something remarkable. Derek Sullivan hadn't been the only person to exploit this particular glitch. Through Freedom of Information requests and interviews with former bank employees, Fitzgerald uncovered evidence that at least 3 other people had discovered and used similar ATM exploits at various Australian banks between 2009 and 2012. The amounts stolen ranged from $50,000 to $300,000. None of them had been prosecuted. The banks had caught the discrepancies during internal audits, frozen the accounts, quietly recovered what money they could, and then done nothing. No police reports, no public disclosures, just patches to their systems and internal memos about improving security protocols. Why? According to Fitzgerald's sources, the banks were terrified of public disclosure. If customers knew that ATMs could be exploited this easily, confidence in the banking system would plummet. If other criminals knew the vulnerabilities existed, they might reverse engineer the exploits and cause widespread damage. So the banks had chosen to handle these incidents quietly, accepting the losses as the cost of maintaining public confidence. Derek Sullivan had been prosecuted not because his crime was worse than the others, but because he'd gone public. He'd forced the issue. He'd made it impossible for the bank to quietly sweep under the rug. In a weird way, Fitzgerald wrote in his article, Derek Sullivan was punished not for stealing $1.6 million, but for talking about it. The article sparked outrage and calls for banking reform. Parliamentary committees held hearings. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission launched an investigation into whether banks were required to disclose security breaches. But ultimately, little changed. Banks tightened their security. Regulations were tweaked slightly, and the story faded from public consciousness, as stories always do. One unexpected consequence of Derek's public confession was that other people who'd exploited similar glitches began reaching out to him. An email arrived in 2016 from a woman named Jennifer who'd discovered a different banking glitch in 2008 that had allowed her to withdraw from her mortgage account as if it were a savings account. She'd taken $180,000 before the bank caught the error. "They sent me a letter threatening legal action," Jennifer wrote, "but then nothing ever happened. They just corrected my account balance and moved on. I've been living with the guilt for 8 years, and I don't know what to do." Derek met her at a cafe in Melbourne. She was in her 40s, a former accountant, and she looked exhausted in a way Derek recognized immediately. "Do you think I should confess?" and she asked him. Derek thought about his own experience. The 3 years of waiting, the media circus, the trial, the prison time. "Honestly, I don't know. In my case, confessing helped me psychologically, but it also destroyed my career and put me in prison. Only you can decide if that trade-off is worth it." "But how do you live with it otherwise?" Jennifer asked. "How do you just carry it around?" Therapy, Derek said. Lots of therapy. And maybe finding ways to make amends that don't involve prison. Donate to charity, volunteer, help people. It won't erase what you did, but it might help you live with yourself. They stayed in touch. Jennifer never confessed publicly, but she did begin volunteering at a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching people about banking and helping them avoid predatory loans. It was her way of balancing the scales. Another person who reached out was a man named Raj, who'd exploited a different glitch in 2013, this one involving cryptocurrency exchanges and a delay in processing withdrawals. He'd made $400,000 before the exchange shut him down. I keep expecting them to sue me or have me arrested, Raj said during their phone conversation. But it's been 3 years and nothing. I can't sleep. I can't focus. I feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Yeah, Derek said. I know that feeling intimately. Listen, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your life, but I can tell you that the waiting, the constant anxiety, that might be worse than actually facing consequences. At least consequences have an end date. These conversations continued over the years. Derek became an unofficial support system for people who'd committed financial crimes and were struggling with the psychological aftermath. He wasn't a therapist, and he didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he understood what they were going through in a way most people couldn't. In 2019, Derek started a small, anonymous online support group for people dealing with guilt over past crimes. It wasn't about helping people evade justice. Several members had already served their sentences, but about processing the emotional weight of having crossed moral lines they couldn't uncross. The group met virtually once a month. Sometimes they discussed practical matters like rebuilding after prison or managing probation requirements. More often, they talked about guilt, shame, self-forgiveness, and how to move forward when you couldn't undo your past. I used to think I was a good person, one member said during a meeting. Now I know I'm capable of doing bad things. How do I reconcile that? Maybe you're both, Derek replied. Maybe we all are. Good people who sometimes do bad things. Bad people who sometimes do good things. The categories aren't as clean as we'd like them to be. It was through this group that Derek met Claire, a woman who'd been convicted of embezzlement from her employer. She'd served 2 years in prison and was now rebuilding her life as a bookkeeper for small businesses, the only ones willing to hire someone with her record. They started dating in late 2019. She understood his past in a way previous partners hadn't. There was no judgment, no shocked reaction when he told her about the ATM glitch, just recognition from someone who'd walked a similar path. Do you regret it? She asked him one night over dinner. Derek thought about it. I regret the stress, the paranoia, the damage to my family. But I don't regret the trip to Paris or the money I gave to homeless people or even going to prison, because prison is what finally gave me peace. So, it's complicated. Everything's complicated, Claire said, smiling. That's what makes us human. By 2020, nearly a decade after his discovery of the glitch, Derek Sullivan had built something resembling a normal life. He had a job he didn't hate, an apartment he could afford, a partner who understood him, and a group of friends who knew his full story and accepted him anyway. He still paid $50 a month in restitution to the bank. At that rate, he'd be making payments for the next 2,866 years. The absurdity of it made him laugh sometimes. His probation had ended in 2018, which meant he could travel again. He and Claire took a trip to New Zealand, his first international travel since his release from prison. Standing on a beach in Auckland, watching the sunset, Derek felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. Not the manic euphoria he'd felt during those first weeks with infinite money, but a quieter, more sustainable sense of being okay with where he was and who he'd become. You're thinking about it, aren't you? Claire said, noticing his distant expression. How can you tell? You get this look, like you're somewhere else. Derek nodded. I was just thinking about that night, the first time I found the glitch. If I could go back and talk to that drunk 29-year-old janitor standing at the ATM, what would I tell him? Don't do it? Maybe, or maybe just be prepared for everything that comes after. The good, the bad, all of it. Do you think he'd listen? Derek laughed. Probably not. Would you have listened at 29? Fair point. They stood there in silence for a while, watching the waves roll in. You know what's weird? Derek said. I stole 1.6 million, and I ended up right back where I started. Working a normal job, living in a small apartment, struggling to make rent sometimes. It's like the universe hit a reset button. Except you're not the same person, Claire pointed out. You've traveled the world. You've faced your worst fears. You've been to prison and come out the other side. That changes you. Is that a good thing? I don't know. Is it? Derek thought about that question for a long time. Was he better off having discovered the glitch? Having lived through 4 months of incredible luxury, followed by years of crushing anxiety, followed by prison, followed by this slow, patient rebuilding of a life? The old Derek, the one who'd worked night shifts cleaning office bathrooms and dreamed of a different life, would probably say yes. The adventure alone would have seemed worth it. The current Derek, standing on a beach in New Zealand with a criminal record and a debt he'd never fully repay, wasn't so sure. But he was here. He was alive. He was okay. And maybe after everything, that was enough.